Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Oregon State University Pro, the 2021-2022 fall-winter course. This is number 8 of our office hours. And today we're going to be going over a couple of questions that folks have brought in. Specifically, we're going to be going over types of mapping processes. We're going to take a look at nomadic influences for site design and lifestyle. And then we've got a great question about a solar bowl and potentially how to design that. So it should be a fun class. I'm going to use a little bit of Marfolio Trace, which is an iPad application I use to design and draw. So I'm excited to be able to draw and play today because it's fun. Cool. So I'm just going to make sure that my phone is turned off. Turned off the landline, but not the cell phone. Okay. Let's jump into it here. So we have a big question from Robin Bayers, and I've done a fairly in-depth dive of this. So when we take a look at, oh, wait a second, hold up. Yeah. When we take a look at creating contour maps, if we don't have them, and again, every moment we spend trying to find that contour data, either from local GIS, municipal GIS, county, region, natural resource extraction companies like mining and forestry, all of that is so well worth the time, because if we do find that information, then we won't have to go and gather it ourselves. And as I've talked about before, the information that comes off of Google Earth is from the NASA shuttle radar topographic mission in 2000, where they shot LiDAR of the entire planet. They shot a laser down from the shuttle, and the distance and the time that came back told them what the shape of the planet was. But it had a 30-meter pixel, which means that if you have any elevational differences that are less than 30 meters, which is pretty much all of us, then the computer had to do the scientific guesswork of interpolation and guess where that might be. And so on the x-axis, which is the up and down axis, it can be 15 meters in error, which is substantial. And on the xy axis, which is the horizontals, it can be 5. So this is one of the reasons why, if that's all you have, that's great. It's great to get a general sense of it, but I've conducted surveys for folks whose contours were literally perpendicular to what we found on the land and what they knew to be true, because they've walked the land and it wasn't what they were looking for. So just food for thought that when you are looking out there, all of the contour map generators and the things that are out there, they're all based upon that data set. Some of them say, oh, we've got more accurate data. The problem is that they never source where that data is from, and almost without exception, it's always from that main data set. So what Robin asked was, I'm looking at the process of marking contours on the land for building earthworks. I want to know how to translate a detailed contour map onto the land and vice versa. I've come across various levels: farmers levels, builder levels, A-frame. The book I'm reading, it mentions the laser level is the quickest and fastest, which is the same. I'm having a hard time knowing what to buy. Much appreciated. Any thoughts you have and recommendations? So Robin's on a place called Denman Island in Canada, and I know an amazing grower and horticulturalist there, Peter Janes of Tree Eater Nursery. If you want to check out some amazing varieties in that sort of 7A, 8 growing zone, definitely check out Tree Eater. So one of the things that I wanted to stop on is that equipment for single use, it ends up being very expensive when amortized over the entire lifespan of the material. So if you're getting into this full time, absolutely, at some point you may want to purchase something that makes sense. But up until that point, borrow, rent, it just doesn't make sense to buy off the bat. And almost all things, with a few exceptions, when it comes to equipment, it's important to do that. So there's a couple of ways to mark contours on the landscape. So we've got some show and tell today. This is called an eye level or a farmer's level sometimes. And basically when you look through it, you've got a number of crosshair lines, and then you have a little optic bubble. So basically you've got a site level bubble that goes back and forth. So basically, however high my eye is, I know exactly that wherever my eye is perfectly level. And so if we then take something called a storyboard, so a storyboard is a measuring stick with marks on it that gives us the sense of how high we are in the landscape. And because I know the height of my eye, I also know that where I'm standing is level if we're hitting a certain point. This is what's called a rollout storyboard, which means that just like a measuring tape, it goes all the way in, and then you can pull it all the way out, and you end up with a big old 2 meter storyboard. This is brilliant for remote work. This is brilliant for small work. Won't work on larger landscapes because once you get past that 2 meters, it'll be hard to mark your contours. So easy to use, portable, accessible, really depends on accuracy of use. So if you're not using it properly, if you're not really getting that spirit bubble in the center there, it can be inaccurate. And yeah, this is super short and super flexible. So I've used this in high wind. It's not a real fun prospect. The next one is water levels. So water levels are incredibly accurate. I've used them to build decks and foundations. Basically, you have two different types. You either have a repository of water, which then has a pipe that comes from it, a hose that comes from it, and then goes on to a standard stick. And from there, you can use it to accurately place marks. Or you have two sticks, and they both have water lines on them in terms of hoses, and then hoses connecting, and then they have markings on them. So you can tell where and how the water level changes, because water will always find its level. Even if it's in a tube, you can think about it like a lake in a tube. It will always find its own level. This can be a little hard to use because as you're moving up and down slope, atmosphere can be pressing down on that water and can take a while to equalize. So normally when we move them, we put our thumbs over them, move them to the spot we're working, and then release our thumbs so that way it doesn't have as much time to settle. They're highly accurate. They're easy to make. They're inexpensive to make usually. Usually the only clear section of hose we're using is actually on the storyboard, and the rest of it we've connected to regular garden hose or whatever we have laying around poly. Can take a bit getting used to. You have to account for atmosphere, as I was talking about, and the distance of flags. So if you're marking, let's say 20 feet, 30 meters, etc., you're not going to be able to mark that far because your hose will only be so long. A-frame, which I've used in Africa, Cuba, Canada, the US. It's amazing. It's great. There's lots of good information in the course about A-frames, but you have to watch out because there can be compounding errors. So if you don't create the A-frame correctly and you don't calibrate it correctly, you can be off dramatically. And as you're setting contour, you can be off very dramatically over the run of, let's say, 100, 200 feet. You could be upwards of 5 or 10 feet off. And that can be an issue. So you really have to watch out using A-frames. They're great. They work well. 3 sticks don't even have to be straight. You can calibrate anywhere in the world. All you have to do is find 2 points in the landscape where the A-frame is, one high, one low, and then basically mark what's the left side, because that plumb bob will come down. It'll be a string and a rock, or as I've used in Cuba, a string and a banana. And then you flip that, and then you'll get the other side, and the space in between is center. And there's tons of videos in the content that show how to do that. A transit or builder level. I own one. I've used it a dozen times. It's good to have. I don't think it's been out of this box in 6 years or 7 years. I don't know. It's been a long time. So that whole conversation about, yeah, and it's so tight that I haven't opened it. It won't even open here. So this is a transit. So a transit has 3 leveling screws. It has a full compass that turns around, and then it has a number of what's called stator points inside of it. Now, the great thing about this is that if you set it up, you have the ability to not only set contour, but you can also map an entire property using a process by which the transit's in the center, and you basically have somebody else on a storyboard. And the storyboard that I have, I think it's 3 or 4 meter tall. You can not only get the heights that you're looking at, but also the top stator point, which is the line above the center crosshair, and the stator point below. If you minus them, you actually get distance. So now we have height and distance. And then if you have the compass rose, you also have a direction and a degree direction. We can take that from the scale out on the landscape and bring it into a computer program or into paper. This is how I used to do it. And we basically just map out all the points. Now, what's great about that is you'll have high points and low points. And within that, you end up with a sense of where these points are. And then you can interpolate in between the points what the contours are. Highly accurate to use, if used properly, can provide not only level, but also direction and distance, can produce topographic information. Takes time to become skilled. Used is $200. I think I bought mine new for 400, but it goes all the way up. And it's really something you may only use once. Laser level, I've used a handful of times. I've always borrowed somebody else or worked with somebody who had it. Works really well for laying out dams and plantings and contours. Basically, you set it up again on a tripod. It has a 360 spin on that laser. It sets out a level laser. And then you have a receiver. And basically, you've got the receiver set to a certain point. And when the laser hits the receiver, it goes beep, or it goes beep, 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 beep. Which for me is the most frustrating part about using a laser level, especially if you're setting out, hundreds of flags or thousands of flags. And we still haven't figured out a way to turn that darn thing down, but works really well. Can be rented from local trade supplies. Works out really nicely. The last is drone photogrammetry and RTK ground station. This is normally what I do these days, only because the amount of time it takes me to do something like to create contours and all the rest of it on the site level takes so much longer. But I will still use the site level to set out contours, set out plantings. But truthfully, I use this a lot. This is about $20. And you can use it with basically, you don't even have to have that storyboard. As long as you have somebody that's a little bit taller than you or is standing a little bit higher, you just go, okay, at so-and-so's midsection where the line on their shirt is, because they've got writing on there, that's our point. And somebody else can actually be your storyboard and walk along and plant the flags that you need to. What happens with drone and photogrammetry? I don't remember if I talked about this before, but basically I've only ever used DJI drones. And so DJI drones work really well with third-party mapping software. One is called Drone Deploy. The other one's called Maps Made Easy. Those are the two I've used. I've heard there's others. And basically what it does is it runs a pattern over the landscape. So it's kind of like printing the landscape with imagery. And because it knows where it's taken off, because you've geo-referenced the photo you've taken before you left, which is important, and then it's geo-referenced as it's going throughout the landscape, taking photos, through the miracle of photogrammetry, which is how most of our maps were made in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It basically has reference points, and through trigonometry, it's able to calculate within about 10 centimeter of accuracy, a landscape that is not treed. If you have a treed landscape, it's just going to take the points on the tree because it's purely optical. It's not like LiDAR where that laser will shoot through the trees. With photogrammetry, it's optical. So it works really well in open spaces. And I've done a few drone flyovers. They take like 2 hours. Post-processing is nominal in terms of price, maybe $250. From there, you get what's called a digital terrain model. A digital terrain model is everything you can see, whereas what we want is a digital elevation model. So sometimes a digital terrain model can be a digital elevation model, but sometimes not, because we've got trees there. So at that point, what I've done is I've hired out total ground station, which is real-time kinetic, which means that it's constantly connecting with satellites, and its base station is becoming sub-centimeter accurate. So, that accurate in terms of where it is on the planet. From there, you have a receiver, and you walk along with the receiver taking points in the landscape. Depending on tree cover and cloud cover, it can take up to 2 or 3 minutes to get an accurate point, and it'll always show you your accuracy. So I've used these in tandem by taking all my points in the trees, doing my drone flyover, and sending all that wonderful information to my GIS specialist, who's normally Brent Smith from Paper Street Permaculture. And Brent has another added layer of beauty to all this. He's created a proprietary software, an algorithm that basically will remove the tree height. If I go out and do a tree survey, general species, diameter of trees, general spacing. So that way the program in the computer looks at that aerial mosaic, points out the trees and goes, oh, those look like trees, and then compares it with the data and then removes that with my points that I've made in the trees as checks and balances. Cons, cost to rent and own, high degree of skill required, cost of doing it wrong can be high. You do that wrong, you have to go and rent the material again. go out and do the thing again, especially if you're at end of season, which a lot of people for some reason want fall to be their mapping season when there's lots of good weather in summer. So I always end up going out in the rain or in the wind to go and map at the end of fall. And we're always fighting snow because at some point that snow is going to come. Last point about that, if anybody's interested, is that we do ground control points. So we have ground control points that will either create boards or will spray paint or will flower onto the landscape, big squares with 2 whites, 2 empties, and then a little number. And from there, I'll take a direct reading with my receiver, and those then become control points for the entire mosaic. Super fun to do if you're into that kind of stuff, but that's sort of at that high level if you're doing large properties, 100, 200, 300 acres, and you don't have access to data. There you go, Robin. Robin, I don't know if you're on the call. I don't know if I saw you here.
I am. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Did that help?
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that was good.
Sweet. Awesome. Great. Yeah, if you get me talking about mapping, the whole hour is gone. So we're going to hold it there. And if you want to ask more specific questions, go for it. The last thing I was going to say is if you're on a really small property, I've done this before, like backyards and whatnot, I've taken a string level and basically I've tied it to like the bottom of the house if it was sloped to the back, and you could do this any which way. I run a string level all the way back and either set up a tripod, so usually a 2x2, 2x4, whatever, 16 foot, whatever the drop is, hung that string level, made sure that it is level by putting a string level on top of it, and then basically taken points off of that in terms of the drop going down off the back of the property or the front of the property. I used to do that back in the early days when I didn't know all of this stuff. And I was like, well, how am I going to do this? And because I'd had a lot of experience in construction, I had a line level, I had a snap line, I had all of these things, and I had a measuring tape because I could just reach up to the line and put it down. But more and more when I got into it, I realized it was an extra step I didn't need to do. All I needed to do was usually go on the landscape, go and set contour with an A-frame or my little site level here, and then basically triangulate off of a house. So if I've got 2 points, I can measure out to flag 1, measure out to flag 2, measure out to flag 3. And then if I'm working in scale on paper, which I always do, I can then make all those points. And that became the easiest way to do it. So I go out, set my contours, do that up, take my points, took half a day, took a little bit of time. And I don't think I grabbed my rangefinder. This became a lot easier when I picked up a rangefinder. So rangefinders are normally used for hunting, but basically it's a small optic device that you can look through, press the button, and it'll give you an accurate, usually within the foot, it'll give you an accurate measurement. So I've done that now recently where I'm using that as my measurement tool because, you know, walking wheels are great, but walking wheels are total distance on ground. And what you really want is sight distance. And so that's another way I've done it. And it's that was really great when I began. So anyways, again, if you let me go, I'll go. Cool. Thanks so much for the question. That was a great one. Lenny, I watched a video about a group of indigenous nomadic people last week and was inspired to think about how nomadic knowledge and science could be applied to the design process we're learning. Have there been any examples of such work? I'm trying to imagine how someone might design sites to reflect nomadic ways of living. What would consistently change nomadic dynamic zones look like? What are some pros and cons to constantly moving around and living in different areas within a site? Okay, so you've touched upon, and Lenny, I feel like your questions are continually deepening, so I love it. You've touched upon something that I think is really important. And I think we start with the idea that permaculture, regenerative agriculture, all of these tools, tricks, and techniques are basically kindergarten for ecologically and nature illiterate societies and humans. A number of the First Nations people I know and some of the nomadic tribes I've worked with in Africa, they live that way because that's the way food works. They move because food moves. And the trappings of agriculture, which have been many and varied, and there are so many good books to talk about what we have lost as a species due to agriculture. The foremost for me is always that taxonomists, not taxidermists, but taxonomists, these are individuals who stratify flora and fauna, have come to believe that we should be reclassified as a different species. We're no longer Homo sapiens due to our decreased bone density, due to our decreased height size, due to our decreased dental health, which is due to the types of foods we are no longer eating. We should be classified as Homo sapiens domesticus fragilis, because we no longer can live without technology. And it's a really compelling argument that we have moved so far outside of the realm of the nature that evolved us. Basically, when we hit agriculture, 14,000 years ago, when we started to plant seeds, almost all the metrics of what we would consider vitality, I'm not going to go into birth rates and all the rest of that, but vitality, a healthy human, dropped precipitously. As soon as we went into soft eating foods, there's all of these different issues. Now, I'm not making the case for it. I'm not arguing it's pro or con. I'm just saying these are the data points we have. Now, a lot of the nomadic peoples of the world that are still nomadic, despite all of modernity, are still exceptionally healthy. Not to mention they follow food. So they move, and they move with food, and they move because that's how evolution happened. And so when we think about the fact that we're all sitting down talking about this, the irony is not lost on me, but this is really quite ridiculous, because we have actively created a lifestyle that no longer promotes health. I give that as background because you've touched upon something that's really important. And a colleague and I a few years ago joked that probably the only honest answer we could give anybody who was asking us for site design was to be mobile, because we live in such a changing climate and such a changing time. That being said, it's really not that practical, because we no longer live in groups and bands of individuals. No longer do we have the animal husbandry to move large groups of people. We are Homo sapiens fragilis domesticus, which is a really scary thought. So first and foremost, I wanted to kind of hit that last question was that, what does moving afford you? Optionality. It affords you the option to understand and to move and to actually grow within a landscape. I know a number of, call it extreme individuals to whom I really laud, continue to live nomadically, continue to work and be their own word for themselves as tramps, because they view it really lovingly, and to move and to grow. A client of mine is looking at subdividing their property, and they're looking at taking on a land design or a land ownership partner. And my recommendation to them was, if they don't have to build a house right away, get a trailer, get a tent, and just move around the property. I know the property quite well now, and I've got 7, 8 places I would recommend being, but it all depends on what they want. Do they want to live on that property in the summer, in the winter? Do they want to live there year round? Do they need water year round? All of these things are dependent upon where they live in the landscape. So part of this is this idea of observing a landscape for a year and really walking and meandering. I think Thoreau wrote about it really well in his book Wandering. We've lost the great art of the wander, of just wandering a landscape and actually wandering our lives in many cases, just to experience and explore. One of my values in my context is I follow my curiosities down rabbit holes, and this has been the most enlivening piece of my life. And I do it similarly on my landscape and on the lands that I work with. So being nomadic has a huge benefit in terms of learning and growth. In terms of the way we live currently, we're agriculturalists, some of us pastoralists, but most of us agriculturalists or dependent agriculturalists. So we don't grow any of our own food, and everything we do is based upon another form of labor, which we transact through that tangible trust called money, currency. So I would say that in terms of design sites to reflect nomadic ways of living, you're moving at a whole nother level, because permaculture is like kindergarten for those of us with ecological illiteracy. It's just the beginning. When we get up to individuals like the Maasai in Kenya, they have a whole different understanding of their landscape, which I think I'm just starting to begin to understand. This is my final way of saying, I don't know if I can, being a landed Homo sapien domesticus fragilis who lives through devices and on all the rest of it, I don't know if I can accurately answer your question, but I know that the individuals that I've worked with and some of the folks that I know who live on boats, who are ocean permaculturists or sea permaculturists, they have gardens that they tend on a number of unidentified islands. They have a number of fishing spots, and they work in a very nomadic, a very mobile way. So For the logical part of me, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I think it's probably the honest answer I can give you, is that it's an incredible existence if you can work at it for a while. I think a number of us have been itinerant by choice or by circumstance for a long time. I would never lose that wanderlust if you can, and continue to build on that nomadic type of lifestyle. And yeah, when you're moving, your zonings do change. Now you have certain areas that are cultivated. This is true of almost all migratory people. Even before the advent of agriculture, migratory people had different areas that they cultivated. And it happened over time. You'd find an amazing fruit, everyone would eat it. Kids would go off to the side of the road and leave their little fertility pockets. And the next year or the year after, you'd see these trees come up, and you would see this sort of trailing effect where you had a beautiful copse of trees, and then afterwards you had these trailings because the humans were leaving the seeds along as they were defecating along the trail. And over time that became active cultivation. There's really good information about this. Nancy Turner out of the University of British Columbia, or UVic, I can't remember, has amazing ethnobiographical iterations of the Coast Salish people, which is also a wonderful deep dive, as is Wade Davis, wonderful ethnographies. So I would say, read some of these individuals, read One River by Wade Davis, anything that Nancy Turner's written. And I think that'll help to expand the answer. Did that help, Lenny?
Yeah, that helped a lot. One thing that I might just ask on top of it, or maybe not even ask, a lot of it is just about talking and conversing and trying to understand other people's viewpoints, but not necessarily get an answer. But one thing that I'm thinking about is it's not necessarily turning to have a nomadic lifestyle within the permaculture mindset, but more so it's kind of I'm imagining maybe a hybrid, or even just a little tiny bit. Maybe in the summer your house isn't as good as if it is in the winter on this other spot, and so you just move to a different place on your site during the summer and move back during the winter. Just these, maybe you can take the inspiration from nomadic knowledge to have just these little tiny pieces integrated into a site. In maybe it's not like a kindergarten, but maybe first grade.
Yeah. I think you've got a great point there, Lenny. And I know a number of people, ourselves included, due to our site, we try to do as much sleeping outside during the summer. And if it's on the trampoline, or if it's on the outside bedroom, or if sometimes it's up at the property, and just really being within the site is such a benefit to us. We also move the bed around the house because in winter we have a central area that we kind of live and inhabit, and it's nice to have the bed there. And and then sometimes in the summer months we have to move the bed downstairs, or sometimes to the basement because it just gets too hot. And so yeah, it's a great point. I think the concept behind it that your conversation is hitting for me is that we've become, for lack of a better word, spatially entitled. We want this spot to be perfect. We want this spot to be great. And yet there's so much benefit and value of being able to change yourself, and to change the context that you're in, to improve your skill, your ability, your connection. Dare I say spiritual self as well. All I've learned over time is that the more connected I am to a landscape, the stronger my spirit is, and the stronger my connection is. So I love your points. I think it's a great piece, and just the lessons that can be brought in. Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for talking about it.
Yeah, anytime. Okay. Question 3. Oh, and a random hey Javan. Whoever this is, feel free to put your name and where you're from and all those good things while I'm addressing Nicole's question. Nicole, I'm trying to determine where I should place the fields and expand the forest on my site. At first, I thought utilizing the hillside would be useful for some of the shrubs and perennials for cutting to minimize erosion, bluestem grass, dogwoods, asters. After seeing some of this week's materials, I'm now wondering if the hillside should be considered part of the edge and create a solar bowl around the field. If I consider a solar bowl over time, the site would lose summer sun as the hillside comes into secondary and tertiary succession. Okay, cool, Nicole. So now we're in the awesome moment where I get to draw, which is super fun for me and hopefully fun for you. So got it. And so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I can't do it well. I'm also sharing. Okay, so we're going to unshare that, share this, share the screen, start broadcast. Okay. And then bring up your site. Cool. I can see that, so that means you guys can see that. And then I'm just going to grab a pencil. Okay. So this is Marfolio Trace. You've heard me talk about it before. What I did is I called up the PDF or the Google Drive portfolio of Nicole, and then I brought it in here, and then I scaled it. So there's a really neat function in this program where you can scale. So I basically set it on her scale and put it to 100 feet. So now this is automatically scaled. And then I started going through and making some layers on this. So a bit of a tutorial on this as I'm doing this, just to kind of kill two birds with one stone. So once I've got this centered, I can then put a piece of transparency paper over it. I'm not a fan of the colored, so I always go opaque just so that way I can see it clearly. And then from here, I can draw on top of this and I can toggle it on and off. So I can grab my blue and I can show what the water's doing and just get a sense. And this is what I do whenever I start a design. I just really want to get a sense if I understand the water completely and where the water's concentrating. So I can do that. I can turn this on and off. This gives me a sense of what I'm looking at here. So if I understand you correctly, Nicole, and feel free to unmute yourself here, what you're asking is, if you were to create a solar bowl, so basically creating a sort of a vegetative screen on the back end here, so that way you had more reflective light, so that way when the sun comes, it bounces a little bit and just gives you a little bit more solar. Eventually, because of your solar arc, so this is north-south, so because of this arc here, eventually you would have some western occlusion. Is that what I'm understanding your question to be?
Yeah. So, some of the trees that I'm planting, some of the larger, more mature evergreens that you would cut, like eventually down the road, we have some on site right now that probably need to be removed and recycled, but they're easily 100 feet tall or they're up there. And so I'm concerned if I start, planting larger trees on the hillside versus my original thought was to keep it shrubs and to keep it lower growing, am I going to lose some of that sun?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great point. I think what I would do is I would work with the heights here. And I know we talked about this before, and I've mostly just done this in video feedback. So I don't know if anybody watches anybody else's video feedback, but I thought I would go over this again. So a lot of people are getting excited about keyline design, and it's a thing to get excited about, but there's two major things I want people to keep in mind. Number one, keyline is a design system, a whole farm design system created by P.A. Yeomans. And so it looks through what's called the keyline scale of permanence for all things agricultural, which means that we start at the top, we start at climate, then we go into topography and water and access. We go down the scale of elements because it's really useful for designing. Now, once we get to the land shape, we have something called keyline geometry. Now, it's kind of confusing because they called the same thing twice, almost 3 times now. And as we're getting into more specifics, getting into the site and the topography within the geography, a keyline geometry is one that focuses on taking water from the valley and moving it to the ridge downslope. Now, sometimes you have what's called a key point in your landscape, but as I was telling Nicole, this is what's called a fractured or a what's the other word? Fractured or a part or particle landscape. I forget the word. But basically you don't have all those hill shapes. And so when you have a full landscape, you'll have sort of these ridges and crests. You'll have these ridges coming down. You'll have these valleys. And in the valleys, and you can take a look at your hand. If you do this at home, you can look at your hand and you can see sort of that little finger crotch, if you will. Right there, you can see that's kind of where the water would collect and then drain out. And that's called the key point. So the key point only exists in the primary valley going from convex to concave. But you don't need to have a key point to do keyline geometry. Keyline geometry is the pattern we put upon the landscape, and then keyline cultivation is cultivating on that pattern. This is important. People get really excited about this and go, okay, so that's where you're planting. No, this is the geometry we're going to base our planting design off of. And our planting design is based off of how big our implements are. So if this is a wheelbarrow accessed area, if this is a truck accessed area, all of that will depend upon what the size of your pathways are, and then what the size of your shrubs or your rows are. So in this, what I've done is I've gone ahead and taking a look at the contours here. We've got 424, 416, 406, 402. So this is downslope, and it's downslope, I think, by 2 feet, if I remember doing this correctly. 416, 418, 420, 422. Yeah, so 2 feet. So basically, when we create a keyline geometry, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move water from the valley down slope onto the ridge. Remember, water can't move uphill. And if it's on contour, it's just there. So usually it's static. So usually in wet environments, and Nicole's told me a number of times that this is a wet environment, what I'll do is I'll start to play around with a pattern that might be able to work for us. So I'm gonna turn off this lower one, go back up to this upper one. And so what I'll do is I'll play around with line and line weights. And this is another cool function of this program, is that you can use a ruler in real time, and it's scaled because I've already scaled the program. So again, if we put a line, let's say here, this would be perfectly on contour, right? So we wouldn't expect that water to actually move, or that cultivation line, or if we put a swale there or a pathway there, we wouldn't really expect water to move from the valley down onto the other side or the other slope. So what we want to do is we want to find a line that crosses down slope, doesn't do it too dramatically because we don't want it crossing too much. But if we were just doing our pathways here, let's say, maybe just about like so. And then we can start to play with this type of patterning and go upslope and see how it works. Now, you may have to redo this. You may have to augment, like coming up here. I can see that this generally works, but there might be some augments. So if I remove the ruler, I'll get the chance to free draw. And so I might do a couple of cross ends here, just on the ends here. But this would generally become the patterning I would be using for my cultivation eventually. So something like this, coming up like this, something like this. Just doing freehand now. And the next thing you have to do when you're working with keyline design is you have to have what's called headland space. Headland space is turnaround space for whatever implements you're using. So if, let's say, our implement is a wheelbarrow, and we want to make sure that we have space for a wheelbarrow turnaround, usually you want 5 feet somewhere within there. So we'll come in so I can make sure I've got my 5 foot spacing. Why don't we give it a full 10? So we know that we're there. Come over here, do a full 10. Great, pull out. And now I've got my, I want to move the ruler, not the whole thing. Now I've got my sort of 10 mark there, and I can come in and I can erase everything else. So now I've got my turnaround space, and I would do that for the entire property. So I would do that up here, make sure that's on my 10 foot. Do this down here, probably come back up because we're not going to be turning around at the bottom, but we still want space around the end. So now we start to get a bit of this patterning here in terms of what this might look like. Again, this is super rough. We're just having a study, if you will, of this. We're just playing with it, kind of seeing what it might look like. So much of this is about playing and just kind of experiencing what this is and getting a sense of getting a equidistance. This is the main thing that's so amazing about Keyline, is that you can create equidistance rows that are equal distance to each other. So that might be, let's say, our patterning. And the reason why I took this step to show you is that I did a little bit of sketching before we jumped on the call, and I want to show you generally what I think I would do if this were me, knowing a little bit more about what you're doing. Knowing what that solar sector and arc is, I don't know if I would try and remove it as much as possible. I'd try and keep that corridor open. So that corridor would probably look something like nothing taller than up here. So that way we get as much of our east and much of our west as possible. But I would do some taller trees at the back, and probably anything with silver leaf. So silver leaf maple, there's some great alders that are silver. Basically, I'm using this as bounce. So I'll use these trees to bounce sun and reflect them into this bowl because it's already cool and damp. And then as we get to the side, I'm going to taper with heights. So as a cross section, if this is A and A minus, can I draw off screen? No, I can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put up a whole new, and I'm going to turn this off, turn this off. So if that's A to A, so little screen at the bottom, here's our site, here's that road. And if this is A to A, so if this is A to A, what we would be seeing is we would have our tallest trees at the top, and then we would be coming down in heights, probably down to that shrub layer again, and probably do some shrubs at the bottom just to create, depending on wind, potentially a little bit of a break. So this would be this area here. And again, that would be completely based upon your solar arc for the summer, for the equinox, and then potentially winter, depending on what your growing desires were. Now, if we get rid of that, go back to this, turn that off, turn this back on, then what I would do is I would bring in that patterning. I actually like the pattern we just did better. I'd bring in that patterning. And I've got to move this up to the top. This is the one thing I don't like about this program. You got to move the one that you're working on to the top. Then with this patterning, I would come in and I would start to put in, I think I already started this actually. Then I would start to put in my shrubs and my trees. So what they might look like. So these are kind of all on this line that I was working with before. Cool thing about Marfolio Trace is you've got these little stencils. So you can just come in and you can just draw over top of them. So I would say probably planting on this type of landscape would be useful in this way, just because it would help spread that water and use that water in a way that made sense, but also gave you a little bit of a solar bowl. Not as much as you might want to create, but stepping down and using any sort of silver leaf, and maybe underplanting here with silver leaf as well, making sure that this had some bounce as well, or some pollinator productivity there. I think all of that would make really good sense. And then you remove this, and then you start to see what the landscape might look like with that over top of. But that's normally where I would say I would go with what you're talking about, Nicole, is have a little bit of that solar bowl at the top, and then generally as you're stepping down here, let's do another little cross section. So center on this, go back up to new, take off that. Cool. So what this might look like, if we're doing A to A again, A to A plus, and we're stepping down 1, 2, 3. So, generally we're going to be like something like this. So, we'd have these tall trees at the top, and then we would start to step down to maybe some shrubs, of course, leaving room for pathway. And then we may do some little terraces potentially on some of those keyline geometries and plant on those, still leaving our pathway. So we may do some cut and fill, just so that way it does direct water a little bit more and really tries to take water away from that valley. And then the last thing that I was musing upon on your site, don't know if it's a good idea, but generally in keyline design, what we try to do is we try to vegetate the valleys. So when you're taking a look at this valley, it has all this concentration. So, something to do with potentially an ephemeral pond, And then lots of vegetation, things like willow, red or dogwood, lots of stuff that is used in the ornamentals and the nurseries. I would say something like that worked in would be useful as well. So those were my thoughts. Questions, comments, queries?
No, I think this is what I've been envisioning in a way, but again, I've never worked on such a blank slate and such a large slate that I think ideas do start to get like a bit confusing. And yeah, and so down where like that very bottom corner is, like around the 406, that's where like water pools the most.
Yeah.
So again, we talked about maybe building some kind of pond structure, but if I were to just plant that with very wet-footed shrubbery, do you think that that would also be like an okay proposal? I don't know how open the owners are going to be to building ponds and those types of things. I'm hopeful that they're into it because it'll help with stormwater management long term, especially if I can get that whole rain garden thing situated.
Yeah, I think the main thing to think about is how do you, if that's an issue, if that water at the bottom is an issue, how do you dehydrate that landscape upslope? How do you take that water and put it into productivity? And I think that's where we're getting more and more with these types of ideas where when we're doing these, let's go back to this one. When we're doing these ideas of these little ephemeral ponds that may or may not be connected to, let's say, more of the slope, you know, this might be something that comes this way and moves down. This might come this way and move down. This may come this way and move down. And so what we're actively doing is we're taking and changing the hydrology of this landscape. So this entire area, let's use a purple. So this entire area now is shunted this way instead of pooling down here, if this is really the issue. So if this is the minus we're trying to design around, we may want to rehydrate this other landscape. And by doing so, we're hydrating the plants we're growing, right? So if there's ever a rain, what we end up having is we have these little micro watersheds here. So this becomes, you know, watershed 1, this little area becomes watershed 2, this little area becomes watershed 3, because all of this area then becomes what is captured and created mobile towards those plantings. And if each one of those steps do that, you can calculate it completely out. You can calculate the impermeability, the rainfall, what comes down, what's going to go to the plants, and generally just utilize this area, I think, to a higher advantage than it currently is. So yeah, you could do a pond at the bottom, but the real question is why? Like just storing that water at the lowest point of the landscape is not a particularly useful implement. If you had another pond up or high, or if you had a pump that you were pumping up to, sure. But I don't know if that would be as valuable. I might think about doing fast growing wet feet at the bottom, again, because it's a nursery. So I might think, well, you know, what can we grow down here that if we give it as much water as it can, will just continually create really good water sprouts. And then, you know, think about it from that perspective, but I wouldn't necessarily just make a pond for pond's sake.
Mm-hmm. My other option that I was thinking through is, you know, the site is larger than they want to manage and maintain. And so early on, I talked about maybe expanding that southern edge. And so maybe I just expand that southeast edge a little bit and let that, you know, do its natural succession over time and kind of create more of like a wetland habit and allow trees to establish.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's what, for me, that's what I was trying to get at in this area here, is that, you know, you can just allow it to go natural vegetation. It doesn't have to be actively planted, or you can plant it with natives, or you could, you know, transplant species from down here and bring them up. That's something we do quite a bit of because there's almost always material on site. But some of these ephemeral ponds, I think, would be good insurance for whatever's coming next, because we know it's going to be hotter, wetter, drier, and colder, but not necessarily at the times we want. So having little reservoirs, even if these are ephemerals, like little ephemeral ponds that you know are going to dry up in the summer, but they do create habitat. I've done this a number of times where over about 3 years, they become permanent just because of the collection of material and silt and animals that are in there. It could also just be a lovely little feature of the site, nice place to go walk down to. I could see, you know, these being created as places that people actually want to go and take lunch break at, because it's nice and secluded, and a bench or two around there, and it might be a really nice little feature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I actually have a picture somewhere in my slides. I do get pooling up where the road is. So like there is already kind of a natural sunken divot that I could play around with and really just dig that out and start there.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That sounds great.
Or do you think that's too high? So it would be sitting up around that 224 contour line where that road kind of swings around.
Kind of here?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
almost maybe to the left of the pine tree, actually, on the
Oh,
other
gotcha.
side.
Like right about there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's like what we were originally talking about, where you might have two areas. And so, yeah, that's totally in keeping. And then maybe something like this, and they, you know, depending on when and if you hear back about the pipeline, these might have an overflow to each other, and then this might overflow down into this. But no, I think that's a great idea. And then, you know, you plant this out as well, and you plant the benches as we talked about. Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant idea. And I think it utilizes the resource. You can create more material. You know, generally in nurseries, you want to have straight rows so that way you can go and collect 500 of something or 2,000 of something. But yeah, I think, you know, in terms of the aesthetic, you know, this is really what we're talking about here. This is, you know, the beauty spot. And then you might even use this is a concept I picked up from Ben Falk, where you end up creating key species that are up here that you can see, that then are indicators for an entire planting down here. So let's say this is Saskatoon, for just sake of being, and this entire row is Saskatoon. This is a wonderful opportunity. When this is in bloom, you know, these are in bloom. When this is in fruit, you know, this is in fruit. So it can be a nice little added ecological indicator up there. Answer your question?
It does.
Okay. Probably too deep, but hey, that's what we do.
No, this is great. It's again, it's learning how to gauge this scale, this large scale that I feel like I'm still like unsure.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And just continue to play with it in drawing. And again, if Google Earth is not the place to draw, use paper and pencil. I'll do what's called 1-ups or 4-ups. And so I'll take the grayscale map usually, and I'll put it 4 on an 11 by 17 or 4 on an 8.5 by 11. And I'll just draw and draw and draw and draw and draw and draw. And I'll do like 4 or 5 of these in a row. I was just organizing all my materials, because I'm thinking about backing up or reinstalling my software so I can get rid of that Chrome bug that drives me mental. But I found all of these old drawings that I used to do, where I used to project the base map up onto my whiteboard in my office. I used to sketch out the major areas, and then I used to take photographs. I totally forgot I did this. I used to take photographs at every stage, and then I sent that to my renderer, because I liked working in big scale, and I like working in like 4 by 8 feet. But I think what you need now is you need lots of repetition on this design. Like you need to go into it, draw it out, go into it, draw it out again, go into it, draw it out again, draw in scale. So that way you can get a sense of where everything should go and where everything can't go. Really think about access. So in that keyline scale, permanent keyline scale of all things agricultural, access is before plants, because if you can't access it, you can't manage it. So really think about access on a steep slope like that, and probably coming down the backside, not coming down the valley. Like, where can you enter into it where it makes good sense? Yeah. Okay. Tim had one last question. Can nut trees be used effectively as a windbreak? Hazels can, in terms of the base, just because of their form. They're multi-stemmed, and so they can create quite a good windbreak. I know a couple of folks that do this, and I've done it in a few places. Walnut and chestnut as a upper story species, for sure. You just have to realize that when they're full grown, they have 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet of single stem. which doth not a windbreak make. You know, there's so much air permeation underneath that. So you need to step it up and you need to step it down. We're actually just, we're in, I think, session 3 of creating multifunctional, designing and implementing multifunctional hedgerows with Jude Hobbs, a mentor of mine. And so we're offering this course through regenerative living. And yeah, it's always about stepping up and stepping down. There's a number of great books. Actually, this one right here, this is a shelter belt book from Government of Alberta, Shelter Belts and Varieties for Alberta. You can still find this online, actually. Brilliant book for designing shelter belts and windbreaks and all the rest of it. Some of the species might not be for you, but yeah, it's there. It's actually right beside the Nut Culture of British Columbia book, which is funny enough. So yeah, you can. A tree is a tree. Know that windbreaks create wood. So wind creates wood. This is a funny thing not a lot of people understand, is that so if we have our tree and the wind hits the tree, usually on the back side of the tree, you'll get more wood. And when you cut that as a round, you'll have the center of the tree here, the heartwood here, and the majority of the wood will be skewed towards the wind because it's building up capacity. So when wind hits trees, it's amazing the way they do it. They basically take that kinematic energy and they put it down into the roots, and they use that energy, not just fungi for acid mining into rocks, but they'll use that energy to move down into the roots and to actually shatter rock. So whenever you see a windstorm, you can bet that there's more rock being shattered by these amazing giants that are moving that kinematic energy into the rocks themselves. So long story short, yeah, nuts can be used for shelter belt. You just have to be careful about the permeability, the heights of them. And then always keep in mind that the efficacy of a shelter belt is usually 10 to 20 times its height if it is, 80 to 60% impermeable. So if you do have this 80 to 60% impermeable, you can see through it, but not that much. When the wind ramps up, this is the other reason to make shelter belts step down. When the wind ramps up, it comes up and over, and it'll shoot 10 to 20 times the height. So 100-foot windbreak could have 100 to 200-foot efficacy. And this is really important because if you make your shelter belt in such a way that that wind ramps up and hits your house perfectly, and I've seen this happen, it can rip the roof off the house because of the way you've ramped. It's like taking and funneling water and shooting it towards something and going, oh, I can't believe it had that erosive capacity. Well, you funneled all this energy and it just hit your house. It happens in the prairies because we get this orthographic effect and you get all of this wind that pushes in. It's wild to see, but it's one of the reasons why it's why Bill Mollison calls permaculturalists time scouts. We're thinking about 30 years in the future. We're not thinking today. We're thinking about 30 years in the future. And that brings me to probably a really good point and a great place to end. Although I do see a chat. Hold on. Let's see what the chat is.
Hey, so if my house is 200 feet away from where that windbreak would be, would you put another row in between there?
I would.
Then?
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically what happens is when the wind comes up, it tumbles. And when it comes down, it can come down pretty intense and hold in. And so usually what we're doing is we're creating these multiple breaks. And if you take a look at, actually Jude's got this great image that we found. If you take a look at the English countryside, there were multiple hedgerows always around. So what happened is the wind never really had a chance to pick up speed. If you think about it that way, it's like, think about going down a slide as a kid. If you had that little bump, that bump kind of took a bit of the energy out and spilled out your speed. So it's kind of like creating a lot of speed bumps for wind, if you think of it that way. Cool. Minute to spare. Crystal, is there a Marfolio Trace option for an iMac desktop? No, not that I know of. I think it's a iPad only. I have worked a little bit with some of these graphic tablets. You can tell by the fact that it's wrapped up. I don't use it all that much. I just find that a visual graphic tablet is super useful. Okay, folks, that was a doozy. Thanks so much for participating. Great to see everybody. I love that we're still getting such great numbers on the office hours. So obviously they're helping some of you folks. Thanks for the thanks. I appreciate that. We'll be meeting again in 2 weeks' time. I do want to take like 3 minutes and talk a little bit about things that I really wish you don't do on your plant designs. because I've seen it many times and I want to save you some time. So if you got to go, you got to go, come back, watch this later. But I did want to just touch base a little bit on some of the things that we're going to go into with plant design. So I'm going to share that for 5 minutes and then I'm going to skedaddle because I got an appointment to run to. Okay, cool. So plant design, remember, if it's highlighted, it's important. So we want to get a sense first and foremost of the goal. What's the general idea? What are you working towards? And then what are some of the patterns that you're seeing on this landscape? So Lauren's example is phenomenal in this one. So when you take a look at this one, the patterns that she's dealing with, things like cold, season, solar bowl, edible windbreak, captured overland flow. Some of these are patterns she's dealing with. Some of these are patterns she wants to put upon this landscape. So this would be very similar to what Nicole's talking about. And then what are some of these strategies? So we want to block the wind. We want to capture solar gain. We want to extend growing season. We want to have better management. So she's talking about the big ideas and then she's getting into the specifics and really taking it from top to bottom. Why am I going into this? Because I do not want to turn you into a permaculture shopper that goes into the permaculture store and pulls things off the permaculture shelf. Do not, please, for the love of all that is holy, do not put a herb spiral in because a herb spiral has to be in a design. Please don't. Just really take the time. We've gone through all this time, think through this process, go like, okay, what would actually work here? Don't just go, oh, I don't have shiny thinginitis where you go, I've become a crow and a raven and I think that's cool. So I'm going to put it in there. Really think it through and think, oh, is this actually going to affect my site? And is it going to help with the objectives? People keep asking me questions like, should I do this? And it's always, go to your objectives, go to your client survey. I'm not your client is. Go take a look at what your client wants. And if your client doesn't want it, don't put it in. I know a lot of you are designing these for family and friends and they're not in that same sort of permaculture vein as you. You're designing for them. You're not designing for you. As we get into the second slide, the proposed system has a couple of call outs. You may need to do a detailed drawing here. So it may be too big and you may need to do a little detail and blow it up. Just know if that's the case and make sure you put a little small map in here to blow it up. Just because the title block here is in that vertical format does not mean I want that. If you've settled on your horizontal, as most of you have, and I'm really appreciative because it makes sense for your site, continue with the horizontal. This is just put in here as a placeholder. So these are just placeholders for legends. If you already have existing legends, just bring them in. I go into this in the tutorial, but some of the questions I'm getting makes me believe that not everybody's watching them. Cross section. Why do you do a cross section? A couple of you have done cross sections that weren't really in a place that you were going to design. And so it's really important to put cross sections in places that you're going to design because they give you information. Especially if you're doing a plant design system, I would try and do a cross section on a north to south axis. So that way you can show some of those solar angles. This is a great way to start to do solar real estate analysis. And this is hyper important if you ever do production design. If you're doing production design, water is the fuel and sun is the throttle. Together, plant doth groweth. Without one or the other, plants do not grow that well. So by doing solar assay through cross sections, it can really give you a sense of what you're looking at. You guys know the matrices by now. These will be a little bit new in terms of light needs and water needs, but that's all there. And then what's the interrelationship? So why did you put plant A beside plant B? Why did you put plant C? 3 things people always do wrong on these. Plant them way too close. Always size these for full canopy size. And remember that a person has to get in there and manage. So if you put 4 plants deep, I'm going to comment about it. You need not do that. Make sure you can get in and around places. Make sure you have little access corridors. Second, nitrogen fixers, nitrogen fixers, nitrogen fixers. Do not give me a full woody design and put in a pea plant or a bean plant. Let's get some nitrogen fixers at the shrub layer. Let's get some nitrogen fixers at the tree layer. You need to have them in multiple layers. Take a look at the permaculture orchard, Stefan Stepanowski. He has a production species, then he has a nitrogen fixing species, then he has a production species, then he has a nitrogen fixing species. This is important. Some of those nitrogen fixers can produce things, can produce different functionalities, not just for us, but for habitat and for animals. Really important to come into play. Irrigation. How are you going to water this? Brad Lancaster, plant the water first. Plant the water first. Don't put a bunch of trees into a bare open lawn and say, I think they'll grow. They won't. Give them water. Let me know what the passive watering harvesting will look like. Is that a swale? Is that a hugelkultur? Is that a terrace? Is that a gradation? Is that an overland flow that comes off of rainwater catchment? You need to showcase what this looks like. Take a look at Brad's work. It's all in the materials. Then let me know how you're going to irrigate it. For the first 1, 2, 3 years, plants do need supplemental irrigation. Is that by hand? And then really think about who's going to be carrying that water out there and think if that's feasible. I want you to think through these problems, because eventually when you give this to the client, they're going to be thinking about these problems. Design facilitation manager. How will you maintain this? How will it be watered when installed? Notice how watered is twice because folks have been missing it. Think about needs and yields. And again, SWOT analysis, assignment conclusion is, how did this assignment allow you to better think about your design, your holistic design? How has it informed your design? What are you thinking about? To the folks that are doing bolded highlighting, fantastic. I recommend everyone go to it. It's quick, it's easy, communicates ideas well. And I think that's it. Have fun with it, play around with it. We're getting towards the end of the course, so now is time to pull together ideas. If you want to submit early, I will be checking. So if you want early feedback, if you want a couple of iterations, I do allow that. If you give me 7, that's not allowable. But I do want to give you guys as many opportunities as possible to give some iteration to this, because it's really useful to get that back and forth. But play with these designs. You'll find that it works out really well the more you play with it, draw at it, and do cross sections, and just work with doing really quick sketches. That'll help a bunch. Sabo? Happy. I see really like big wide eyes when I came back to the main screen. Hopefully folks aren't too surprised. All right, folks, such a pleasure. Really looking forward to seeing the rest of your work, and we'll connect in another 2 weeks, and we will see new assignments in a week. You're most welcome, Kevin. Most welcome, Candace. Everybody take care, and we will see you later.